Hey, what is up guys, I'm KBHD here, and usually when you see a piece of tech that is way cheaper than the others in the category, like way cheaper, you just default to thinking it's probably inferior in every way. But the Moto G5 and the Moto G5 Plus are the result of Motorola not really cutting down from higher end flagships, but more building up as high as they can for a certain price. And they've come up with this year for 230 bucks. They're still killing it in the budget game. So I want to shine another light on this because of the fact that I keep coming back to that good phones are getting cheap and cheap phones are getting good. Probably the biggest difference between this gen Moto G and the last one is just the outside, the design, and the hardware. The Moto G has always been this shamelessly, apologetically plastic, but this year it steps up to metal. So all around the back and the side and the frame, and it feels a lot better and more durable as a result. Now the looks are a little bit more polarizing. It definitely still looks a little bit better because of the metal, but it also definitely still looks like a budget phone. It's the bezels that are still big on the sides and the forehead and the chin, no doubt about that. And it's a pretty basic design from top to bottom. Nothing too crazy about it. Button placement is standard. The headphone jack is still at the bottom. All of that is great. But one thing that makes this feel a little more cheap is actually the chrome rail, like all the way around the bezel. You don't see that really in like the renders, but in real life it actually does make a difference. I feel like on the more premium phones, the bezels are usually just more shrinking down or much more dark to sort of fade out the way. But the chrome here around the rails is much more reflective. Kind of reminds me of the Galaxy Nexus, just a little bit less curvy. But that's not really a bad thing, it's just something you notice about the phone. The one thing I would say I don't really like about the design on the outside of the new Moto G is that big old camera lump on the back. I really think if this phone was the exact same size but didn't have that big bump sticking out, it would look pretty clean. But this sticks out of it so much that it's a defining feature of the way this phone looks. The Moto Z had that big old camera bump because it was a fitting spot for all the Moto mods that fit on the back. I don't think you had to have this big camera bump on the back of the G5 because there are no Moto mods for this one. Either way though, overall the build quality and feel in the hand is a step up from last year, and when you compare it to other smartphones under 300 bucks, which there aren't many of, this sits up at the top pretty clearly in my book. So the specs of the new Moto G are also decidedly mid-range, about what you'd expect. A 3000 milliamp hour battery in this G5 Plus, and there are two versions of it, one with 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of storage, that's 300 bucks. And then this $230 cheaper version of the phone has 2 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of storage. That is expandable though, since the phone does keep that rare micro SD card slot. And the software experience of the Moto G is pretty classic Motorola, mostly pure stock Android, but with some enhancements that they feel will make it better. And I really like that about them. That's something they've kept where they don't have a whole skin on top of Android. They don't have a whole suite of redundant apps. It's nothing too crazy. It's again near stock, but when they have certain software or hardware features, they like to integrate them to take advantage of each other. So when they have an OLED display, for example, they like to take advantage of that with software. So one main place they saw for enhancement on this phone was the home button. And it kind of stems from a weird place from it being budget, but this phone has a weird home button situation. There's one big physical home button with a quality fingerprint reader down at the bottom, but then there's no back or multitasking buttons on either side of it. It's just blank space and a wasted chin. But then on the screen, you can have fully normal software buttons, your back, home, and multitasking. But of course they take up screen real estate, and not everybody wants that. So their unique solution for people who want to use all off-screen buttons is what they've called home button gestures. Apparently the home button is actually big enough to use sort of like a big glass trackpad. It's actually sensitive enough to figure out what you're doing if you're doing a button press versus a gesture. And these seem to work fairly well. So when you turn these on, it's a tap to go home, then it's a hold for a second to turn the screen off, then you can hold a little longer to get into Google Assistant, then you can swipe right across the home button to go back, and then swipe left across the button to go to recent apps. And you can actually interchange those last two if you want to swipe right or left. Another enhancement here in stock Android to the Moto G is gestures to go into multitasking. You basically just drag the window up to the top. I actually think this is better and easier to remember than before. So you kind of drag into the multitasking experience and drag out of it. Makes sense. And then there's other little things like the slightly transparent theme in the app drawer, and the Moto widgets that you get on your home screen that show the battery and the time and all that stuff. The screen off gesture that came with the original Moto X. You have the double chop to turn on the flashlight, which is familiar. You have the double twist, which launches the camera really quickly. That's still there. So all those gestures and all those enhancements come down to the Moto G again, and they're awesome. So I've said a lot of good things about this phone, but it's not your perfect, flawless fantasy phone. It's definitely not quite perfect. In order to get a phone down into the price that you get this one into, you gotta make some trade-offs, obviously, to cut costs. For one thing, it's still using micro USB down at the bottom, which isn't a huge deal. You could say that it's really just fine if most people don't use USB Type-C yet, but I would have liked to have seen USB-C. And then this is also missing NFC, which was a bit of a bigger deal on a certain other phone, but that phone was claiming to be a flagship killer. This one's not claiming to be any of that, it's just a lower priced phone, so it doesn't have the NFC chip. That may or may not be a big deal to you based on how often you use mobile payments. And then the speaker up at the front, it's decent. It's definitely not the loudest and not the clearest out there, but the thing is, it's better than most of the high-end flagship smartphone speakers nowadays, strictly because it's front facing. So it doesn't have to be as loud because it's pointed right at you. I just wish it was a stereo pair, since it's kind of weird holding the phone sideways and then having the audio come from one side of the phone. And then I think the camera is the area where you'll see the biggest drop off, the quickest drop off from when you had a high-end flagship phone to this lower price. On paper, it's still a 12 megapixel smartphone with an f1.7 aperture, but it doesn't have optical image stabilization. So you can get pretty good shots out of this camera when you're really well lit and when you're outdoors and when you have a lot of light. But as soon as you start to lose light, you're gonna see a lot more things like noise in the frame because it's raising the ISO to shorten the shutter speed to keep that motion blur down. You're gonna see chromatic aberration, you're gonna see a lot less dynamic range, a lot more contrast, and overall just a lot less natural colors. It's not quite as good of an image processing, and Motorola's struggled with high-end cameras in their best phones, so this is definitely not gonna be the phone you buy for the camera quality. But at the end of the day, when you start comparing this Moto G to a lot of the other phones you can get for the same price, for $250 or less, it becomes really obvious that this still falls as a complete package at the top of the heap. So can we give the budget crown back to the Moto G? I think so, yeah, I think it's gonna deserve that. This Moto G5 Plus takes a lot of the cues from the bigger, more expensive brothers, but is also coming from the low price that the Moto G has always been and sort of elevating it into a phone that kinda feels a lot more like a premium flagship, or at least tries to. I'd even say that the budget flagship has previously gone for me to phones like the OnePlus 3 and the OnePlus 3T, but now those are sort of creeping up into like $450 price ranges. They're kind of edging up there and starting to compete with flagships now. So for the best phone that you can get under 300 bucks, it's kind of a no-brainer. Moto G is holding that crown. So if you're balling on a budget, this is the phone to check out. This is the one. So that's been pretty much it. Thanks for watching. I'll leave a link to this phone below. I'll leave a link to all my other phone reviews and other stuff below as well. Talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.